I asked the oncologist, how long would I need to be on the chemotherapy? He said, for the rest of your life. So I said, well, I really don't want to live the rest of my life feeling ill just about every day. I would rather be as I am. And my inner sense was, it's okay. Well, 9 years later, and I'm still here. And tumors keep popping up, but they don't seem to do anything very much. They haven't disrupted my life. I had no symptoms. It was amazing that what I'd been doing was setting up something that actually I'd been following possibly for most of my life. And that was to do with what I now call my meds. Mind, exercise, diet, and support.
Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Forum. I'm so glad you're here. I just want to ask you a quick question, and that is, are you interested in creating a world that works for all? And if you are, please consider attending my retreat this October 17th through 20th at Unity Village. And there is also an option to attend virtually. And this is all about coming together to co-create a world that works for all beings on the planet. You can go to thespiritualforum.org/retreat to learn more, or you can email me at revcarolsaunders@gmail.com. We often have people from the podcast listeners coming to the retreat, and I just love to meet you face to face. Let me introduce my guest to you today. Brian Holley has been living with cancer for 15 years. And in his book, What My Doctors Didn't Tell Me About Cancer, he shares his journey of exploration, discovery, and self-determination, revealing some alternative integrative approaches and supplemental practices to the traditional allopathic medicine model. Spiritually, his life has traversed fundamentalist evangelical Christianity and exploration of Eastern religions, Quakerism, and eventually he landed as a self-described spiritual tramp and religious has-been. I just love those terms. I just want to say that I believe that Brian brings hope to those that are afflicted with any kind of chronic disease or medical diagnosis, and I'm going to let him fill in the blanks of his very interesting life, which I believe began in London as bombs were being relentlessly dropped on the city during World War II. Welcome, Brian.
Hello, thank you.
So where are you sitting now? You're somewhere in the UK.
I'm right in the heart of England, a county called Herefordshire, and it's just on the borders of Wales. It's one of the most sparsely populated areas of England. We only have 70,000 people in the whole county, so there's not much traffic, and we have lots of lovely people around us, and it's a very friendly place to be.
It sounds lovely. It really does. Get out of that big city and out into the country. So your book is really interesting. Your whole journey is so interesting. And so why don't we just start by you sharing your journey, your spiritual journey, your medical journey, and how you got to where you are today. I told a little bit of it, but that's just kind of the general structure. So why don't you fill us in on some of the details?
Well, it's a long life. And I usually start by saying, how long have we got?
Well, that's a good question. I'm kind of wanting you to be a little succinct in about 10 minutes or so, but we'll pull out the really interesting parts.
Sure. In this aspect of my journey with cancer, I discovered all sorts of things about my past, and that I didn't really expect to find. And that kind of integrated my spiritual, physical, emotional awareness in many ways. But I look back, and have done for quite a long time, to a point when I was about 9 years of age. And I was living then in a little village in North Somerset, and sitting on the pavement, a beautiful sunny day, leaning against a sun-warmed wall, when I suddenly fell into this state of total peacefulness. I didn't need to think about anything. Didn't need to do anything. I just sat there. And I think if one of our neighbours had come along, it was a very quiet village, so people didn't come along very often. If one of my neighbours had come along and seen me there, they would probably phoned an ambulance, because this isn't the kind of boy that just sat there on the pavement doing nothing. But it was something that I never shared with anybody until much later in life. And I realized that that was a marker. I had discovered something that had brought me a sense of peace. It given me a taste of it. And it would be many years before I realized what this was about. When I was a small boy, my fascination was history. And one of the things that I loved was the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, and how Ariadne managed to find the thread to get out of the Minotaur's den. And in a sense, that's a bit like me, except that it was the other way around. I was finding my way back into this place of peacefulness, and with that kind of Ariadne's thread. Mixing my metaphors there, I'm sure. But it certainly made a difference to me in many ways. And it left something in me which I felt gave me some kind of strength, and I can't understand why. But I'd always expected something positive. And I'd got up to many, many adventures in my young childhood where I'd broken arms and cut open heads and falling in rivers and goodness knows what else. But I always expected to get through. And in fact, as a young married man with a family and a house to look after, my assumption was that I could always do something. It wasn't until I got halfway through that I realized that I couldn't, but by then it was too late. So I've left a whole trail of houses that needed to be fixed. But my attitude has always been positive. So when people say, "Oh, you're so positive," well, maybe I am, but I don't have to be. It's just the way I am. Maybe there's some genetic stuff there. Maybe I learned a lot of stuff from cycling. Lots of ways in which our lives get formed, but it doesn't always have to be a contrived way. So the next step, I guess, was when I was in my early 20s, and I was by then married. I had a family of 3 small children, was in the army, hated the army, but because I had a family, it was the easiest option. But then I found evangelical Christianity and threw myself into it wholeheartedly. And for 10 years or more, I was a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, which gave me a lot of security. I felt very, very secure in believing all the stuff that I believed. And that was necessary at that time. And I learned a tremendous amount. I read the Bible several times. I even went to Greek classes to learn Koine Greek and follow through the New Testament. But suddenly that all evaporated. And for about 10 years, I found myself in a fascinating career first of all, as a careers advisor, and then later on as an information officer in the career service, responsible for computing and various other things. And that gave me terrific intellectual satisfaction, which, looking back, my religious experience was very much to do with fulfilling my intellectual inclinations, because once I got those satisfied, I didn't need to go into the Bible and to the heavy study that I got into in those days. So it was that kind of change that took over until must have been about 1984 when I read Joseph Campbell, or at least I heard Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was interviewed by an American reporter who, there's a series of 4 programs called The Power of Myth. And that
Yes, I remember that.
transformed the way I was thinking about spirituality, about religion, about my whole religious background. And that took me into Eastern mysticism, into meditative practices. Not that I'm very good at it. And eventually in, 2009. Oh, I should go back to 2007 when a neighbor of mine who was a retired clergyman, he and I would have some very good philosophical conversations. And one day he said to me, "Do you know," he said, I think Quakers might suit you." I hadn't really thought about it, but I went along. I said, "There's a meeting just a few miles away," and I went along to Quakers, and it was like coming home. That's suddenly I found people who'd been reading the same stuff that I'd been reading and understood what I said about certain words I used. And that was a new revolution. So I threw myself into that. I'm a real thrower in. I threw myself into fundamentalism. I threw myself into the army. I threw myself into the career service, etc. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Anyway, I got involved. And I learned so much about silence among my Quaker friends that connected with that very tiny link back there when I was 9 years old. And that was the beginning of putting my life together again. The big transition was from being wholly spiritual into more of a spiritual, physical, emotional, whole person. And that happened in 2009 when I suddenly was diagnosed with kidney cancer and they took a kidney away. And that was a big shock. Up until now, I could face everything. I was okay. I could get through this. But now I was really at the end. Where do I go from here? And I had to reach a point where I said, well, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the close of my life. And I wrote a letter to my children telling them how much I love them, what they meant to me, and asking lots of forgiveness for the silly things I'd done in the past. And sealed it up, only to be opened if I didn't make it through the operation. Well, I did make it through the operation. I got rid of the letter and went on. So the story then is the real beginning of my spiritual, physical integration of understanding my body, listening to my body, finding out how my body informs my mind, finding out how my inner self, my inner strengths and weaknesses were able to find something else within the body itself, to be able to interrogate the body almost, and to have that conversation so that I wasn't any longer on my own.
So could we pause right there for a second?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I really want to get into this next segment, and I'm very excited to learn about that. But I just want to pause for a minute and reflect back on the journey that you've just shared with us, because I talked to so many people, and I just find it really interesting that a lot of people have had this kind of unique spiritual experience at a young age. And I wonder if all of us don't, but that we just kind of forget it. But you have this really unique experience when you're 9 that I think has informed your life, because you had this experience of peace, and so you know that that's attainable. And I'm just kind of conjecturing if that's not a part of our childhood, but we just kind of move on, or it's not really honored in the family or the socially or whatever. And so we tend to ignore it. But I love that this was a touchstone for you.
Mm.
And I'm sure we might come back to it as you move on. I think that you're pointing out that you've always expected something positive in your life is very, very, very interesting. And I really am going to guess that that's going to have some part, play some important part in your healing journey, that expectation of something positive versus expecting that everything is going to go down the drain. I think that when you share your religious journey, that you point out when you threw yourself into the evangelical Christianity, that you discerned that it was because you found security in belief. And I think that's important for people to know, because a lot of people are really anti-religious, or they make fun of religion, or they think religion's wrong or bad, but it actually is a place that can help people find the security that they're looking for in a very, very, very uncertain world. What's so interesting about your story, though, is you were a spiritual seeker, obviously, because you kept moving on. And I do also remember that series with Joseph Campbell. And what I think is so interesting about him presenting mythology is, for me at least, it didn't throw out that actually helps solidify some of Bible stories to me, because you can now look at it mythologically, you can look at it symbolically and not so literally. And he really brought, I think, a lot of religious symbols alive. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to just kind of highlight of your journey, which has been so interesting so far. And then now let's go into what this whole mind body experience and finding yourself in your body. Let's go into that part of your story now.
Okay. I think one of the aspects of this possibly arose out of cycling. My father got me into cycling quite a young age, and he and I would often cycle 100 miles a day. And to do that, you had to dig a bit deep. And I often look back on life, and one of the spiritual exercises is looking back when you're having a problem and realizing that okay, you cycled 70 miles, you've got another 10 miles to get home, it's starting to rain, it's getting dark, you're seeing people in their nice, brightly lit, warm homes just having supper, you're hungry, and you've got to make that last 10 miles home. And you have to find some way to dig deeper. I lived in an area called the Cotswolds, and the hills are everywhere. In fact, it's rumored that some of the hills don't go down again. Um, but
Mm.
this business of cycling up a hill, you can reach a point where you look at the hill ahead and you think, it's not going to get any worse. So it's little things like this that lie in the back of our minds, which are very physical experiences, but have a terrific spiritual lesson for us. And to know how to find that inner strength, that inner depth, to know that it's there. It's not me. And I think that's the thing that's been so important, because I know that much of my religious experience was a religious ego. But what I say about religion is it has a leaky roof. Where the spiritual gets through anyway, even though we're trying to protect ourselves from it, and we end up getting something out of it, even though it's not the way maybe it's not as pure as it might be. So it's this whole question of integrating the body, integrating the mind, integrating the spirit, and finding that each aspect of it informs us in a significant way. And it may not be to do with words, it may often be to do simply by that sense of peace, of knowing, okay, that's going to be all right. I remember I came round from an operation last year and was in serious pain for 45 minutes. And by then I had learned how to breathe in to the source of pain and to breathe out from it. And although I was still in a lot of pain while the doctors were trying to sort out what has gone wrong and what they could do about it, every now and again I'd reach this point of peace where I was not exactly free of pain, but free of fighting it. And
Mm.
that's really the important part for me is this not resisting things, allowing them to happen, allowing them to be where they are right now, but then finding that in doing that, there is a sense of peace behind it that one can find that enables you to get through. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's incredible. I mean, I've had a lot of friends who've had cancer, as I know most people have, but most people have either like, it's like in remission or they passed. But you've been like living with this for a while, and it seems like you've been living a good life. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, I don't know why. Right from the outset, once I'd had the kidney removed, everything settled down and I felt fine. 3 years went by and they kept an eye on me and gave me routine checks. And then in 2012, they said, there's a lump in the adrenal gland. So they took the adrenal gland away. And everything settled down again. I felt fine. I was back to walking regularly, exercising, gardening, doing all the things that one does. And then 3 years later, the cancer was back to the kidney bed where the kidney had been, and it started going again. Later that year, in another test, about 6 months later, they discovered that I had multiple tumors all over my lungs. Not very big ones, and they weren't growing very slowly. In fact, I wouldn't have known I'd got anything there except for the CT scans. And so I was faced with a question my oncologist posed to me. Well, we can give you a chemotherapy, and told me all about it. I went away and researched it. So, well, I'm towards the end of my life. It would be nice to live a bit longer, but certainly I've had a good life, and I don't really want to spend the rest of my life, because that's what it was about. So the oncologist said, I asked the oncologist, how long would I need to be on the chemotherapy? He said, for the rest of your life. So I said, well, I really don't
Mm.
want to live the rest of my life feeling ill just about every day. I would rather be as I am. And my inner sense was, it's okay. And I thought, if I'm very, very fortunate, I might even have another 5 years in me. It's just how it goes. Well, 9 years later, and I'm still here, and tumors keep popping up, but they don't seem to do anything very much. They haven't disrupted my life. I had no symptoms. I wouldn't have known about any of them until I had a breakage in my arm. But it was amazing that what I'd been doing was setting up something that actually I'd been following possibly for most of my life. And that was to do with what I call my meds: mind,
Hmm.
exercise, diet, and support. And I realized that I had been exercising quite a lot. I'd been doing a lot of meditative stuff. We'd been onto a pretty good diet. My wife became very keen and interested in dietary things. So we were eating well, and I was well supported by my family, friends, and then with a whole group of therapists and doctors, etc. So I felt pretty good. And that seems to have maintained where I am at the moment. How long that can go on for, I really don't know. But I'm not anxious about that. And the lack of anxiety has quite astonished me in many ways. I went to see a kinesiologist, lovely lady, for various issues that had arisen actually out of acupuncture. And although this was physical treatment, the acupuncture actually took me to some very deep places in my life where there was a deep root of anxiety. And the end of that was that my kinesiologist helped me to get through that stage of a lifelong anxiety that hung around the back of me most of the time. Some of it came out of those war years of insecurity that had left a little whirlpool of trauma there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that in all of this, that I was not concerned about it. And so my kinesiologist did a test. She said, "Well, look, let's see," because I said, "Well, one of the things I'm wondering about is whether this background anxiety is my suppressing the fact that I am worried about my cancer, and therefore I ought to be doing something about that." Well, she tested me, and each time she did the test, she said, "Oh, you're not concerned about that. You're not worried about that. No, that's not it." And it felt right. I knew it inwardly that it was right. And a few weeks later, I went to an all cancer support group, and we had a lady there who was doing ear acupuncture, which was interesting. And she found she was able to go around and find various levels of stress from a little point in the ear, and everybody was having some kind of stress or another. So when she came to me, I said, "Well, I don't think I am stressed, but please go ahead." So she spent a long time trying to examine my ear and trying to find this little pimple thing, whatever it was in there with an electric probe and all sorts of things. She said, "No, you're not stressed." And
Interesting.
that is very much the key here is acceptance. That's not kind of abject surrender. Neither is it indifference. It's an acceptance of what is, what could be. But more important than that, one of the things, or maybe the thing, that really has dominated my life over the last year or so is that life always seeks the best that can be. Now, the best that can be may not be absolutely the best by my ego standard, but it is the best that can be without force and without coercion. And this is the way that what I call enabling love. Some people call it God. I call it enabling love. Enabling love works by this way. There is only one principle, and that is love. There is only one purpose, and that is love. And life arises out of that love somehow. And when we realize that, we begin to accept that life will always provide us with as much love as we need at the time, either to get through the problem or live with the problem, but it will always be there and it will always be a comfort.
That is an amazing spiritual lesson. And I mean, that's the take home for everybody who's listening, that there's a loving presence and it's always there to give. And I think it's interesting to really, really focus on that when we are faced with any kind of dis-ease. Because the diagnosis, people can get scared with the diagnosis, and I think they can go into battle. We live in a war paradigm, and I think we look at our bodies as something has invaded, something is wrong. I need to put on my armor, and we need to go fight it. And we're going to fight it with drugs, or we're going to fight it with chemicals, or fight it with something, because it needs to be annihilated, it needs to be gone. And that seems so antithetical to we're living in a benevolent universe and there is a loving presence and Our bodies are here to inform us. And maybe all of this dis-ease, maybe your cancer is something that is informing you and not something to be battled against. Did you kind of come to that conclusion yourself?
Yes, absolutely. I realized that I'm not sure that I ever saw it as a battle. I think I had already reached a point in my spiritual life, at least, where I had, through life's lessons and through grace, had found a way to accept and not to react. Yeah, sure, I do react now and again. I get a little ego reaction. I'm a human being, damn it. But for a lot of the time, I find that there's nothing there. There's a lovely passage in the Tao Te Ching which says that the tiger will find no place to put its claws, and the ox will find no place to thrust its horns. And it's a bit similar to Jesus
Yeah.
saying that your hand will poisonous snakes, etc. It's a bit like that with me, and I've got all these kind of enemies within, or potential enemies within, but they're harmless because I just don't fight against them. I don't withstand them.
Yeah, but the
And
allopathic
that's,
model kind of does. At least my experience is it seems like the allopathic model of and I know you and I both know there's a place and for doctors and the medical world, and it's very, very good in a lot of different ways. But overall, I think that that model looks at our bodies or the conditions of our bodies as something that needs to be fixed or fought or something, so I think that's what you're presenting is these alternatives to that. And spiritually you come to this place where there's nothing to fight, and so you're seeking other kinds of support models. And I just encourage people who are listening, no matter what the disease is, that there is something to just accept. I think that's what you're telling people. So there's an acceptance, and that there's just kind of this peace associated with knowing that there's a loving presence and that there's nothing to really get rid of.
absolutely. Life always seeks the best that can be. That's my mantra.
I love that. Yeah,
And
I
when I
love
look
that.
at nature, I live in the most beautiful area and I'm out with nature a lot. When I look at nature, it is in the nature of nature to nurture. That's what it's about. Even my cancer cells are trying to nurture themselves. They're wounded, poor things.
Right.
They're not there. There's no malevolence in them. They have gone wrong. And largely because of my fault. It's been my responsibility, my bad habits, my drinking too much beer, my my eating wrongly, my doing things to my body that have caused problems, smoking especially. So yeah, so I have a responsibility here, and I have a responsibility to nurture my tumors. Sometimes it is necessary that we reach the point where some terribly harsh and heavy-handed treatment needs to take place. But it is possible for certainly some of us, maybe an awful lot more of us than we realize, to reach this point where we can accept and live with what we've got and find that, in fact, the body is quite able to cope with what's going on. The immune system is an amazing thing. It keeps us safe all the time, and it does it very, very powerfully in miraculous sorts of ways. And very often the treatment that we get is actually hindering what the body can do very well itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you have to make the judgment. You have to decide at the time. And what I want to emphasize here is that I am not saying follow my way. This is just what I've discovered. Now you may get some pointers as to how to go about following your own way, but for goodness sake, don't just copy what I've been doing and expect the same results. We're each of us totally unique. We are unique beings, and we have to find out what
Hmm.
will work for us and how we can implement it in our lives. And I will give anybody any help I can, but I can't tell them what to do.
Can you share? Can we go back to your meds? We talked about mind, exercise, diet, and support. And it sounds like you've had a long time commitment to cycling. And so, you've had exercise ingrained in your life. Can you tell us a little bit about what changes you've had to make for the mind, diet, and support aspects of these areas?
Yes, because as the body gets older, so I've had to cut back on what I'm doing, and especially with my condition, I'm not able any longer to cycle 100 miles. I just
Okay.
about managed to walk 3 miles at a reasonable pace. But so I have had to adjust. I haven't got a bike anymore. It's the one thing in my life I really, really miss. I love just
Okay.
blowing the tires up and getting ready to go. It, so I have had to adjust. I have to pace myself, and that's the important thing too, because the dear old ego wants still to rush around and do all the things it was doing before. And what I need to do now is to take it more slowly. And I'm finding the pressures of getting back into having written a book and being involved in all the administration of it is somewhat of a distraction. There are things I have to do, but this is another aspect of my learning is finding out how to maintain that sense of peace while at the same time being under pressure to achieve things by deadlines. Seems to be a contradiction in terms, and I'm sure you face it a lot in your
Oh yeah,
work
I think
too.
that's kind of the human condition. Yeah.
And
Have you
so,
have you did you go ahead.
no, no, go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. I think I was going to ask you to go into diet and support part. Maybe explain a little bit more about how you've changed your diet and your support systems.
The diet is largely plant based. We buy organic as far as humanly possible because unfortunately our food has become increasingly contaminated by
Mhm.
fertilizers and pesticides and all sorts of things that are getting into our food chain. And most of the time, for most of us, the immune system handles it. That's a remarkable thing. But when you get to older age and when you have conditions, then you're in danger because the immune system is not as able to cope as well as it used to. And so, therefore, we have to make sure that we look after our diet and our exercise. Those two things really come together because the keeping the cardiovascular system going, making sure that it's functioning as fully as it can be, aids the immune system and aids the digestive system and so forth. Everything depends on that. So keeping those two especially together is as an
Yeah.
important part. So we eat properly, sitting up to the table, and we don't usually slump on the table. On the sofa. We do sometimes, especially if there's something on TV we want to watch. So I, sometimes we sometimes I do give in. I've cut right back on sugar because that is one of the things that cancer is prone to. Cancer cells take in 7 times more sugar than ordinary cells.
Mhm.
So we really need, as cancer patients, to suffer the deprivations of sugar. It's milk is another problem that can happen. I take very small quantities of milk because the milk has hormones in it, growth hormones in it that are there to raise a 1-ton bull, and I don't want to get that big.
Yeah,
So,
it's not
you know,
natural.
looking after looking after those aspects of ourselves. So we do what we can.
Okay. I'm kind of interested in your inner journey, and did you find anything about yourself, your growing up, your experiences? You talked about anxiety. Did you learn that there's any connection to the conditions in your body connected to any of your past or trauma or anxiety or anything like that? Did you learn anything about yourself through the condition that you have?
Yes, very, very much so. I think that the key thing was through my acupuncturist realizing that there was a connection between the anxiety, which I experienced right here in the solar plexus, and it's the area where in Chinese medicine is affected by fear, the kidney area. So it was
Mm-hmm.
a big jolt in a sense when I was told that, yeah, kidneys are affected by fear and anxiety. So that is where you would expect that to find. So at school, I often had problems of, I had a very bullying headmaster, which I was very fearful of. But there was one key dream when I was 4 years old, and it was during the war years. We were living with my grandparents and my great uncle in a small house. Occasionally, my aunt and uncle would come home from the RAF for weekends. So we had a house full of people. My uncle bred Samoyed dogs, and there were dogs as well. It was all complicated jumble of children and dogs and people and anxiety because I remember the next door neighbor was killed when his boat was sunk. And this
Uh,
was happening all the time. And
mm-hmm.
when I went to Bristol to the hospital, as I often did, there were bomb sites all the way up the road. The whole place was in a terrible state. And although these things didn't affect me very directly at that time, I realized that there must have been a background of anxiety amongst my parents and everybody around. And I was just picking up those signals, but not knowing what to do with them and not knowing what they are. So I had this dream, and the dream was that I'm walking up a well-lit path towards absolute blackness. And either side of the path was a whole row of snakes on each one. Each snake was looking down at me, its tongue flickering, and I had to talk nicely to these snakes to keep myself safe as I walked into this blackness. It didn't worry me that I was walking into blackness, and I don't understand quite why the path was lit, but maybe there's some significance there. But I had that dream so often when I was a 4 year old that I remember it in detail now. And so I think looking back, that was one of the key elements that had set in place trauma and taught me about the kind of trauma that we pick up in all sorts of ways from parents, friends, enemies as we go through life. And we don't know it's there. We're all
Mm-hmm.
suffering some kind of trauma, and we don't know that it's there. We don't know what to do about it. Fortunately, my acupuncturist was able to identify this, and I was taken to a place of great peace. And as I said, my kinesiologist took it on from there. Um, and I believe that now has cleared as far as I'm concerned. It's brought me to a much deeper place of rest.
Oh, it's so interesting. I think you raise a really good point. We all have trauma that we're unaware of. And I think what happens is if we didn't suffer anything that was obviously a huge trauma, we think that we're clear, but we're all connected and our society is in a state of trauma. And so we're going to pick it up from all over, generational, family, and your experience. It just makes me think about makes me think about being a child in a situation where there's bombing or a war going on, and children don't really understand all that, and they're not making it necessarily catastrophic because it kind of becomes their reality. And I know for myself,
Right.
I grew up in Northern California during the '60s, and there were riots and police riots and hippies and all this kind of stuff. And I remember thinking that was just what life was, riots and bomb threats, and it didn't really it didn't really impact me. But everyone around me was concerned about it. And so that has to have kind of impacted me, just as like the war and the bombs had to have impacted you. And then what do we do with that? Somehow it goes into our bodies and manifests in some way. And so sometimes I wonder if the body is it saying, hey, there's something here for you to deal with. There's something for you psychologically and spiritually to look at.
Absolutely. The body keeps the score. I was having coffee with a lovely lady friend of mine in the local cafe, and we started talking about these things. And suddenly she asked, whose anxiety is it? Now, that was a significant moment for me
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
think that was the point that I realized, hang on, this may not be mine, may not be something, maybe something I'm holding on to, but I don't need to because it isn't mine. It's somebody else's.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay, Brian, we're coming up on our hour. I want to highlight what you said before, and this is a quote from your book, because I think this is so important. This is what you wrote. I can't remember what page it was, but the first response to a problem should not be rejection, but acceptance. Acceptance of it and all its apparent implications. And I love that because it's so counterintuitive. It's not what we're trained to do. It's not always what our amygdala response is, where a problem comes up and our first response is reject. And what you're saying is that shouldn't be our first response. Our first response should be acceptance. And how much more peaceful our lives would be if we practice that we accept it all and its apparent implications. Like you say, don't fight the pain. You can't get rid of it, but don't fight it. And that there's some sort of condition of just peace and protection and I guess care in that situation. I think that's a really important message that you've given through your life and through your book.
Thank you. Yes, it's about love. That's what it is. And you approach things with love, everything changes. And we are still deeply embedded in a warrior culture and have been for thousands of years. We're beginning to learn to escape from it. It's going to take generations, but we need to become aware of that warrior culture that does so much harm and damage to all of us all of the time. And acceptance and
Mm-hmm.
love
Mm-hmm.
is the key.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else that you want to share? Is there anything that we didn't cover during this time?
No, I think I've shared what I can here.
We will have all of the links to your books and your work, but I think that that is a great note to end on, that it's all about love. And I think we can shift this paradigm. We can shift it. We just have to say no to the warrior model. We just have to say no to the rejection and the fighting, and just remember that everything in this universe is for us, and it has a loving presence, even if it's what we would say is bad news. You've taken your whole cancer diagnosis and turned it on its side, that it's not bad news. It's part of your condition that you've in part caused, and that you're living with it and loving with it.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Brian, for joining me today. And thank you for your wisdom. And I just bless your journey and wish you many, many, many more years of a good life and a loving life and a happy and supportive life. And I appreciate you coming on today. And everybody who's listening, I know you've picked up something really amazing from this conversation. Thank you for joining us. And I now close the Spiritual Forum.